Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
We encourage all the groups to say that every voice is important.
Yep.
And so everyone's invited to be part of the discussion and say why they think what they think about what a passage might say or about a certain topic. And then to explore a little bit about, what the Bible says about that topic as well.
How easy is it to be a Christian teenager in a state school or even in a Christian school? How do young people receive answers about faith or other big questions of life? Well, our next guest has some keys and programs to help address some of these issues. Lara Ruddle is the CEO of Mustard Leadership Australia, and Mustard is a schools ministry organisation that exists to see lives transformed by Jesus through students leading other students to Him. That's Lara Ruddle, our guest today, with myself, Brett Ryan, for Focus on the Family, Australia. Well, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's such a needed one, that how to inspire young people to share their faith with their peers, their fellow students. But why don't we start with your background and then how you got involved in Mustard?
Yeah, sure. So after finishing uni and an arts law degree, I decided to go and become a lawyer, and I did that for 10 years. I ended up focusing mainly on family law by the end. So I've always been passionate about, families and relationships. And obviously the family law side of things, you often see the brokenness in those relationships. But I guess in my church life and Christian walk, I've done everything I can to try and be proactive and strengthen relationships. So my husband and I were involved in running pre-marriage courses. We were really involved in the youth group. We were the kind of couple that, would take a week of annual leave to go on the youth group camp. And everyone would think at work that was totally weird that we would want to spend a week with teenagers rather than go to Queensland or something.
Yep.
And then I guess after doing that for 10 years, we had kids come along, and I did the part-time thing for a couple of years or a couple of kids and realised that law was a pretty tricky profession to do with a family, particularly when it involves litigation and judges setting timetables.
Yeah.
And so I took some time out and invested in my kids and got involved in mainly music and playgroup and some of their activities and really loved that and saw that was a unique time in life to bring people together and build community. And it was a time when people were thinking about their values and what they wanted for their kids.
So you're not one of those people who are just theorists about your Christian faith. You've really worked out and to help others come to understand who God is. So it's part of your DNA, isn't it?
Yeah, I love bringing people together to think about how to connect with each other, how they want to bring up their kids, what's important in life, and then to, live that out together. So so then I was fortunate to, almost fall into a job at our church where I was kind of the children's and families events and outreach coordinator. So I organised lots of events that brought people together, ran some parenting courses, some fun, just water fights, big slides on the garden and on the playground and car park that, people could walk in and be part of on a 40-degree day. Ran a night, what it's like living in a developing country. So just lots of random things, I guess, that just brought people together to consider some of the bigger issues in life and some of the issues that involve thinking about our values.
Yep.
And then
Mustard came along.
Yeah, and then Mustard came along. So I knew Pete Caroline, who started up Mustard 21 years ago now, and he'd been involved in our youth group. He was the youth minister at the time when he started it up and saw a real need in schools to make more of a connection rather than people having to walk straight into churches, provide a place in that school arena where they could discuss issues of faith. And so my husband and I had always been excited about that and kind of watched from the sidelines for a long time. And then, this role came up as CEO of Mustard kind of as I was moving out of the role at my church. And so it was just perfect timing. And
That's awesome.
Been doing it for 4.5 years now and loving it.
That's great. And I'm sure in that time and even just prior to that, there's been a lot of changes in legislation that has made things a little bit more difficult about having Christian presence in schools. And so we'll talk more about that, but the emphasis now is not rather the adults going to do the programs, is actually trying to empower young people to do the program.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, there has been quite a shift in legislation and also just in the way people are seeing the position of faith, I guess, in the school arena, which has meant that in some states adults can't even go into schools and talk about faith anymore. So our lunchtime groups were places where we'd send in, a young adult, a uni student to facilitate a lunchtime group. But, yeah, in a lot of places now that's not allowed. And so we did wonder whether that was going to be the end for Mustard, but I think God just gave us this vision that actually the students are the ones in the schools, and it's really specific in the legislation that students are still allowed to talk about their faith, which is a good thing for free speech, and hopefully that's not going to change anytime soon. So, now we're all about empowering the students, and actually it's a better model. So it's all about students sharing their life experiences and their faith journey with their peers, with their friends, and what better way for them to hear about it.
Now, it sounds pretty obvious, but the name Mustard, it's not tomato sauce and mustard, it's a seed, it's small. So explain a little bit more about the history of the name Mustard.
Yeah, so it's come from, there's a couple of passages in the Bible that talk about mustard seeds, and one of them talks about, I don't know whether you've seen mustard seed before, but they're super tiny little black seeds that you fit kind of hundreds in the palm of your hand. But in this story in the Bible, it talks about the mustard seed growing and becoming this amazing tree that the birds of the air and the animals can find safety and security. And we like to think of our lunchtime groups a bit like that. So taking something small, like a student who might not think that they're great at leadership, might only have an ounce of faith, and then they can grow these lunchtime groups into a space often where lots of people are coming, 30 or 40 kids are coming to some of our lunchtime
That's
groups.
Awesome.
And they're places that provide that safety and security. Everyone's welcome. It's a place where you'll be cared for and loved, and we find that a lot of people, walk through the door with questions, and then a lot of people walk through the door just because they want somewhere safe to have their lunchtime.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk more about the actual program in a moment, but I love on the website, it says students leading students to Jesus in schools. That's what we're all meant to be about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can think of one student. She's a pretty special student. She's part of a very small church, so there are no teenagers in her church. And she didn't know
so
any
she's used to being alone.
And didn't know any other Christians at her school. And so she kind of said, but I just feel like I've got on my heart, I want to share my faith, but I don't know how to do it. And so she got in touch with us, and we said, well, look, let's just pray for some other students to join you, some other Christians, because it is hard to start something on your own. It's good if you've got at least one other person with you. So we prayed for 6 months with her through COVID. Then she went to a school rehearsal, and it was a casual dress day, and she was wearing a T-shirt that said "Created with a Purpose" on it, a T-shirt she'd designed. And someone said to her, "Oh, you're a Christian." And then someone across the other side of the circle went, "Oh, I'm one too." And so suddenly she had 2 Christians that she had no idea were in the school who could be part of this group. And she now leads a discussion group in her state school in a courtyard.
Yep.
And she uses that as a space where people can just come and ask their questions. She often puts stuff on Instagram, and so people come and ask about the Instagram posts.
That is so good.
And then after school, she runs a Zoom for those who want to actually delve into the Bible a bit more and find out what it actually says.
So, go a little bit deeper.
Yeah,
now,
so she's a real inspiration.
Obviously, you're trying to empower and train students to bring other students along, but does Mustard offer other services?
Yeah, so the other thing we do, other than working with student leaders in the lunchtime groups, is we run chapel services and seminars. We used to run them in the state schools, but with some changes in legislation, we're focused more on the independent schools now, where there are still lots of people who don't know a lot about Jesus or still have lots of questions about faith. So we'll take a topic that's important to teenagers, like measuring up or community, connection, and then we'll weave the gospel into that and give them an invitation to consider faith, but always make sure that there's, a message for everyone there
very
as well.
Practical, challenging, but at the same time maybe convicting.
That's exactly right. Good summary.
That's awesome. You mentioned a little bit about the change of climate, about it used to be a lot easier for Christians to be Christians in a secular society, but that's becoming more and more restrictive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately. And we're seeing that in these Christians who decide that they want to start groups and they feel the opposition. And sometimes this can come from principals who don't understand the legislation and so say straight up, no, we don't have religion in our school. You're not allowed to have a group.
Yep.
And then Mustard helps work with these students to have the conversation with these principals and staff and say, well, look, actually, if it's student-led, it is allowed.
Yep.
And so most of the time then the club's allowed, although sometimes they'll make it difficult and not give them a classroom and things like that.
Yep. So what's the answer there?
Do it on the oval. Do it in the courtyard. So, that's working well for some of our students. I mean, we did have one student recently who, unfortunately, a teacher just obviously really didn't understand and, said you can't have a classroom. And so he thought he'd run something on the oval. And then when the teacher found out he was running it on the oval, they gave him a detention.
Right. We're talking about persecution.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's hardly persecution when we hear of our brothers and sisters across in this wide world, but that's still significant for a teenager.
Significant for a teenager So, we're working with him to re-engage with the teaching staff and kind of work through that and hopefully find a good solution.
Yeah. And what's sort of the feedback you get from a student who was probably in a little bit of fear and trepidation about stepping out in faith, and then what happens to them and their transformation of, when one or two people even drop in and then it grows? And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how it happens because we kind of often think that a leader has to be the most mature and confident kind of person, and that's probably the way it often works in the adult world, maybe. But we find that it's sometimes a student who just has a heart to want to share their faith that is willing to step out and start a group. So I can think of one girl she's up in Mildura, and she, similar to my other story, kind of didn't have a lot of other Christian teenagers around her, and her brothers had walked away from the faith, and her mum kind of said, she was on her way to walking away from faith as well. But she connected in with us, and they actually drove her down 4 hours from Mildura to Melbourne to one of our conferences. And she decided she wanted to lead a group at her school. And so we, gave her some resources and connected her with her on Zoom, and we had some national training Zoom events so she could meet other student leaders and learn from them. So she didn't feel so alone. And so she didn't feel so alone, and she's been able to, she led the group, she grew the group, and then she was able to pass the baton on when she finished Year 12, and so encouraging. So it was a great lesson for us as at Mustard to just not kind of think that a leader has to come in a cookie cutter kind of shape, and that actually it's really just about finding those students that have that heart, and that's enough. And then God will use whatever gifts they have and draw other people around them who have some of the other gifts the group might need. That is so good. I look forward to hearing more after this break. Our guest today is Lara Ruddle, the CEO of Mustard Leadership Australia, and you're listening to Focus on the Family Australia.
The Word for Today is Australia's most widely read daily devotional, designed to give you practical teaching to keep you focused on your relationship with Jesus. Read it online or subscribe to the free printed edition at thewordfortoday.com.au.
Well, welcome back to Focus on the Family Australia, and we're talking with Lara Ruddle, the CEO of Mustard, an organisation that helps support Christian students to minister to their friends about Jesus in their school. You mentioned before the break about sometimes the uniqueness about creating a haven or a safe place. So what would be a typical experience for a student who may not necessarily have a faith, but what would they experience coming along to one of your sessions with a fellow student?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, they'd be welcomed in. And we usually encourage our groups to have food because that's always a good way of just bonding, I guess, at school, lollies, chips, and to have some kind of games and activities at the start that kind of bring people together and build energy and connection. And then different groups run their groups in different ways depending on their leaders. So some of them will look at the Bible, some of them will look at a topic that they might want to explore. But I think as part of all of them, we encourage all the groups to say that every voice is important.
Yep.
And so everyone's invited to be part of the discussion and say why they think what they think about what a passage might say or about a certain topic. And then to explore a little bit about, what the Bible says about that topic as well.
Yeah. Admittedly, these are young people who aren't experts, but they're rolling up their sleeves to have a go. And
absolutely.
It's challenging for adults hearing this about, would I do that? Would I do that in my workplace? But they're doing it in their schools, and so commend them for doing that. But from that point of view, a lot of the young people who come along to it may be a little bit disenfranchised. They've got social anxiety or they feel like they don't have a friend. This is a really safe place for them to come along to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we certainly find that there are people like that who might find the playground or the lunch yard a bit daunting, and so they are welcomed in. I can think of one boy at a school who was having a tough time at home. His parents were getting divorced and he was, had some issues at school and, felt like there wasn't much point to life really. But he went along to the muster group, saw it advertised in like the school newsletter, and it became the highlight of his week. And he actually, his parents kind of said they didn't know whether they could keep sending him to the school, and he was just desperate to stay because he loved the mustard lunchtime group so much, and he had to leave for a little while. But his chaplain rang me and said, which other schools have mustard groups, because he wants to go to a school with a mustard group. And unfortunately, he ended up going to a school that didn't have a group, and he had a really tough time there. So he managed to convince his parents to
return,
let him come back to the school. And the mustard group continues to be kind of a highlight for him in his week.
Really encouraging to hear, especially for the student leader who's facilitating that, to have someone who felt at home and felt safe.
Yeah.
And that's a key word in that. And then in that environment, then it introduces an opportunity to bring the gospel into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mentioned in my opening remarks, how hard is it to be a Christian in a state system now, to be a student who stands up for righteousness, to stand up against the crowd and be countercultural?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's really hard in most state schools. I mean, it does obviously differ from school to school and the leadership culture they create. But I think overall it is hard to stand out and say you're a Christian. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's, a lot of negative press in the media about Christianity and what, their views might be on certain topics. And so that, creates issues. The LGBTQ issue, obviously schools have groups to support those people now, and we've had situations where those groups have confronted the mustard group or the lunchtime group and said, you hate us, and you've even moved your group onto the same day as ours so that you're in direct opposition to us, and that creates a kind of sense of conflict. And so that's kind of been one of the challenging areas, but it's been really amazing to see how some of these groups have really embraced the LGBTQ community and invited them into their group. I can think of one girl who said, look, why don't you just come and see what our group's like and see that we don't hate you and that we'd love you to join us. And at the end they ended up praying for them all and just building that understanding.
They kind of assume what it's like until they actually see it for their own eyes. They can come to their own conclusions. And I think that's very powerful in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, but it's not easy. I mean, even in the Christian schools, we've had kids as they're walking into the lunchtime group be yelled at by other kids. Oh, you're off to that Christian cult. And yet this is a school that's got a chaplain and has chapels. And I think there's just a lot of opposition. And we visited a school recently as well and talked about science and faith. And we did a survey before the program, and 60% of kids said that basically science disproves God.
Right.
So there is, at that academic level, there's a lot of thought that, if you believe in God, then you're not basing your life on facts, and you've got kind of some airy-fairy view out there that, isn't really sensible or accepted. And so, that comes out in the classroom as well through some of the teaching sometimes, as well as, through students. So one of the sessions that we have on our list of resources is on science and faith, because that is a big issue for kids. And we say, look, invite your friends in. And we had a school recently that did that. There was one boy who just really felt like, how does evolution and creation work together and all these kind of things? And for us to be able to say, actually, they can work together and, they don't have to be polar opposites.
So just to unpack that a little bit more. So you provide some sort of framework for them to take in, and whether it's a Bible study or an issue. So is that right?
Yeah. So we have a web app that has resources that kind of fit within that lunchtime time slot. So little Bible studies, little videos, topics that they can consider that we think are kind of useful for teenagers. And it's totally up to them whether they use them or not. They drive the curriculum, but we just provide opportunities. And we're in the process of just creating some new ones, actually, which is really exciting.
Oh, great. You mentioned about the Bible study, but then you said they can discuss other issues. So what are the issues that young people are facing today? What are you hearing and what are you receiving from some of your student leaders? Yeah.
So I think where do you find your identity is kind of an age-old issue, but it's, just as prevalent today. And I think that whole kind of measuring up and comparing yourself to others in order to find your identity. And so that's obviously in school situations with, academics and sporting fields and things like that. But I think, social media has just ramped it up all the more because they're constantly looking at, pictures and videos of other people who seem to be living better lives than them.
Yeah, very much so. The social media platforms and living the perfect life, and it can feel very dissatisfied or discontent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if that's the way you live your life, then it's just a kind of roller coaster of emotions, because one day you feel like you're doing okay, but then the next, you look at someone else and you feel like you're doing a whole lot worse. So that's one of the kind of seminars and chapel services that we present on, to kind of just encourage teenagers not to find their self-worth by comparing themselves to others, but actually they're each unique and made by God and loved, and they can be satisfied in that and find contentment in that.
So what are the challenges for you finally in the last few moments about this ministry? Is, obviously funding is one thing, but the opportunities, how can we be praying for you?
Yeah, I think we want to empower and inspire as many students as possible to be living out their faith at school. And I guess, we just want to have those opportunities to be able to reach those students. So we spend a lot of time visiting schools, if we're allowed into the schools, or churches or youth groups or youth camps and that kind of thing, and just trying to sow the seeds into the youth that they can do it. And sometimes it takes several times, like, kids will come on a camp one year, they might hear a workshop from us and think, oh, that's interesting, but I could never do that. And then 3 years later, they come back to us and say, hey, that workshop? Well, I think I'm ready to do it now.
That's so good.
Which is super exciting. So I think, just the opportunity to connect with students and for us to then be able to sow those seeds and then for them to be bold enough to take that first step.
Yeah, and that's what you want, just that first step, and that builds its own momentum. And I think there's many of our listeners today would be saying, I wish I could have done something like that when I was younger, because it actually solidifies their faith, isn't it? Really, It strengthens their faith.
Absolutely.
And that's inspiring in itself. So it's not just for the people they minister to, it's actually for the individual to grow in their faith. And,
absolutely.
And we're talking about persecution. We're going to have it. We shouldn't be surprised. We like everything to be in a neat bow, but it's that going through the difficulties, and starting a group like this could be that impetus they really need.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think we've just celebrated our 21 years. And so as part of that, we've been kind of doing a bit of a where are they now, and looking back at the people who are involved in Mustard in the past and then where they've moved on to now. And I think, talking to a lot of them, they say that opportunity to lead at a young age really held them in good stead for what they went on to do. And so lots of them are leading churches, leading not-for-profits, or doing other amazing things in their work spheres, but living out their faith strongly. And I think, having them kind of invested in those younger years and showing them that they could be leaders really helped put them on that trajectory.
Good. Well done. Well, thank you for being our guest here today, Lara.
Pleasure.
If you want to find out more about this ministry and how you could become involved, you can go to their website at mustard.org.au. That's mustard.org.au. If you'd like to find out more information about some of these issues that teens are facing and how to help strengthen them in their faith, you can go to our website at families.org.au. On behalf of the rest of the team, I'm Brett Ryan, inviting you to join us for another edition of Focus on the Family, Australia.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.